Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you.
I'm here to talk about something serious, but I'll try to also give you some happy news about what we're expecting from the world in 2016. Domino's was just here up on the stage and telling you that they were 50 years old. That was by way of saying that they're a very old company and that the average company is 50 years old. Well, The Economist this year is 172 years old. We were founded in 1843 when Queen Victoria was 24. That gives you an idea of how long we've been in the game of trying to make sense of a messy world. And for the past 30 years, we have been producing a publication called The World In, a yearly look at what we expect from the year to come. The World in 2016 has just been out. You can get it on newsstands, or you'll get it as a subscriber to The Economist, where our staffers and some guest contributors will tell us what they expect to see from the world in 2016. Now, predictions usually err on the downside. There's a couple of psychological reasons for this. First of all, negative predictions are more salient. People tend to notice bad news more intensely than they notice good news, a fact that's well attested in experimental psychology. The second reason is that if you predict bad news like a crash, you will tend to look like a prophet. If you predict good news and it doesn't happen, you can always say, well, wait again until next year. So the downside tends to get outweighed. We try to take a clear-eyed look at both the good and the bad, and I'll start with the widest view of what we see happening in 2016, and then narrow down to a couple of specific trends we see coming up. First of all, this is the year of the developed economy. You heard that right. For the last several years, developing economies have been dominating the picture of global growth, led, of course, by the staggering rise of China, but also the rise of India, Southeast Asia, and other developing economies. They've been giving the world most of its growth, while America, Europe, and other developed markets have been shaking off the hangover of the financial crisis and the Great Recession that's followed since 2008. Well, that trend is now looking like reversing itself. In this year, most of the growth will come from the rich world countries as China slows down and India is not big enough yet to pull its weight. We'll get a little bit more into specifics about those two countries. This is what the picture looks like regionally. As you can see, America is the fastest growing rich world region at 2.5%. And we even have, finally, some good news from Europe. Overall, the European Union will grow by about 1.5% this year, led by slightly better 1.8% in the Western European countries. We have positive news that Africa is continuing to expand its middle class and is growing at a respectable 3.6%. And we're seeing great numbers from the Asia region, despite the fact that China will be slowing down. Remember that China slowing down means growth of only 6.5%. That is a staggering huge number that would be fantastic for almost any other country in the world. The big news of this year is that India, for the first time, will outgrow China and will, in fact, be the top growing major economy in the world with growth of over 7%, something that you'll hear a lot of positive news and crowing about out of India. But you have to remember that India is starting from a much smaller economy to begin with, so has quite a lot of ground to make up vis-a-vis China. What is this going to mean for the distribution of wealth in the world? 2016, we forecast that the top 1% of global wealth will be greater than the wealth held by the other 99% of the people in the world. Now, if you know anything about The Economist, you know that we are a free market, pro-market publication that typically calls for smaller government, lower taxes, lighter regulation, and so forth. But we have been calling for years attention to the serious problem of inequality. And inequality is resulting in this period in history in particular due to a trend noticed by the French economist Thomas Piketty in the book that he put out last year, Capital, in which he made the simple point that returns on capital are now greater than returns on work, so that people who already have capital are seeing their share of the pie expand, even if nothing else changed. Benjamin Franklin once was attributed the quote, you may have heard from someone else, that money makes money, and the money makes more money. So it's easy being rich because your money sits around making more money for you, and if you're poor, you don't have that working in your advantage. And you also have many other problems that cost you. The fact that you won't be able to afford the kind of education that helps you make more money. The fact that you may be ill, which costs you not to be able to work, and so on and so forth. So the problem of inequality is only getting more severe as we pass this milestone here in 2016. This was alluded to a couple of presentations ago, the rapid growth of Netflix. You don't even see Blockbuster on this chart. They've been left in the dust years ago. But in this year, Netflix is now passing the big four American broadcasters in their ratings. This is ABC, NBC, CBS, and Fox. You can attribute a so-called implied rating to Netflix because it doesn't have traditional ratings. And this is the year in which it has passed the fourth of the big four to become, if it were a network, the biggest in the United States. A measure of disruption, a word that is overused, but Netflix is truly a disruptive company, changing its industry extremely rapidly. Here's a milestone. In 2016, the number of babies being born outside of a marriage in England and Wales will shoot just over 50%. A safe bet in any prediction game is moral panic. Trends like this do show a real change in how our families are structured in the Western world. But moral panic need not be an actual prophecy. We know people will wring their hands and rend their garments and say that this is the end of the family as we know it, but it need not be bad news for England and Wales or any of the other parts of the developed world, including Scandinavia, where families are taking traditional shape. Important for children is that they have two parents, and not necessarily that those parents be married. But this is a secular trend we see in the United States as well as in other parts of Northern Europe, and it will reach this symbolic milestone in England and Wales in 2016. The big question hanging over this country is the timing and, of course, the result of David Cameron's planned referendum on so-called Brexit, decision whether or not the United Kingdom should leave the European Union. We believe that the referendum will be called this year. 2017 will be more unhospitable to Cameron, who has already begun the process of renegotiation. France and Germany, the other two biggest and most important countries in the Union, will have elections in 2017. And it won't be a good idea for Cameron to put the British referendum up against those votes because those countries will be in no mood to give Britain a lot of new concessions. Now is the best time for him to try to get what he can from the other European partners, call the referendum, say he has gotten a great deal for Britain, and to win it. Our base prediction is that he will win it, narrowly. The main reason is the result that we've seen in Scotland. When we had the referendum in Scotland, we saw an undecided vote, too close to call. In the end, it was not a particularly close vote. And the reason is that a negative campaign based on anxiety, based on the fear that a step into the unknown would be bad news for Scotland, led those who were undecided to vote to remain within the UK. Expect David Cameron and his Tories to say, well, Europe is awful, but going out of the European Union will be even worse. It's a negative campaign. It's a bit dreary. It may not, in the long term, solve Britain's problem as an EU member, as an awkward EU member, if they win on an essentially negative campaign. The EU is bad, but the alternative is worse. But this is an effective strategy which we expect to prevail. In the United States, it's very hard to say exactly what to expect from a very unusual primary season, which will result in an election in 2016. I think it's safe to say only that it's going to be a brutal campaign. The amount of money spent in American political campaigns continues to grow astronomically, so that whoever ends up the Republican and the Democratic nominee will spend vast sums of money. It was over $1 billion per campaign in the last election, Barack Obama versus Mitt Romney. We will expect to see those numbers much bigger still in 2016. Attack ads, every dirty trick in the book, as all the Republican nominees and a few Democrats strive to become their standard bearer and win the race. The country's in a bad mood. Despite the fact that America has the best performing economy in the rich world, more than half of Americans continue to say that the country is on the wrong track. And we see that crankiness, that bad mood, of course, reflected in the rise of anti-establishment candidates, most notably Donald Trump, but also Ted Cruz, who, despite being a senator, is considered an outsider and a bit of a maverick and a crazy, running against his party rather than to its core. It is impossible to say at this point whether Donald Trump makes it to the finish line as the Republican nominee or not, but he has dominated the polls since the summer. No maverick in his position has done this for this long. Mavericks rise and fall as the country looks at a variety of different candidates, and then they typically make a big gaffe or something about their past is revealed, and boom, their candidacy is all but over. Every time Donald Trump makes what the rest of us, people in the press corps, maybe some of you in the audience, would consider an unforgivable gaffe, it only seems to strengthen his position. He says, the press is out to get me. They don't want to hear the truth. This has so far been astonishingly successful for Trump, and the people who are waiting to become the anyone but Trump candidate on the Republican side are doing their best not to alienate any of his voters, hoping to hoover up those supporters should he eventually stumble. So we could see a very bitter, very divided election in 2016. This, we predict, will be the year of the macho man in global politics. With an America that will be extremely distracted by the election that I just mentioned, we expect to see people like Vladimir Putin, most notably of Russia, but also Xi Jinping in China, Prime Minister or President Erdogan from Turkey, and the sort of tough guy leader really be prominent on the world stage. It's a time of uncertainty, of conflict, most notably in the Middle East, and even when economies are rough, people trust the tough guy leader they already have, more so than ever. Russia's economy, most notably, is absolutely in the toilet after a year and more of sanctions based on the invasion in Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea. Yet Russians still implicitly trust Putin, and this is because he so successfully gives this image of being a tough and strong leader. Even if it's in crisis, crisis is the worst time to change horses when you know you have a tough guy on your side. As for Xi Jinping, whom I just mentioned, he has an extraordinary grip on power just at the moment in China. He's a little bit halfway through his sort of 5-year term. They don't have terms quite like, say, a prime minister or a president does in the West, but he's at a critical period this coming year where he will be able to replace some of the central members of the Politburo Standing Committee and thus put his stamp on the ruling party. And he is sitting fairly pretty popular and unchallenged at the moment. China is slowing, as I mentioned, to about 6.5%, but that is very far from a depression or a recession. It just means that the living standards in China will not be increasing at the pace they were expecting to. So the refugee crisis, one of the things we failed to predict, I will say honestly, in the world in 2015 that we published a year ago this time. But I think it's a safe bet to say that it will continue into 2016. The real misunderstanding, I think, that most of the Western press has about the refugee crisis is focusing on what are called the pull factors in the countries receiving the refugees. Do we give too many benefits? Are they coming because this is an English-speaking country and maybe they speak English? Are the Scandinavian countries too generous, and that's why Sweden has the biggest refugee population relative to its overall population, and so on and so forth? Well, these pull factors only affect the refugee flow at the margin. Far more important are, of course, the push factors. People don't move from Syria to Sweden because they've heard that the benefits are nice in Sweden. They leave Syria because it is a war zone expected to be just as miserable in 2016 as it has been in 2015, perhaps worse. There are regional powers who have been sort of warily putting toes and fingers in Syria, places like Saudi Arabia, in Iran. That conflict could still get yet worse if the Turkeys, the Irans, the Saudi Arabias commit more to a war. Not to mention the fact that, of course, Britain and France have stepped up bombing campaigns. America has been involved in bombing and in the region for quite a long time. Expect this push factor to dominate the story, and forget about all of the pull stories you'll see in some of the press. Moving to the business world, we'll look back on some of the things I already mentioned. Two factors have been responsible for an extraordinary period in corporate profits. If you read the general economic news, you'll see low economic growth, you'll see inequality, you'll see lots of bad news and gloom. But the fact is, for the last few years, they've been fantastic for corporate profits. They've been absolutely huge, especially in Britain, in Europe, and most notably in the United States. Two factors have accounted for a lot of those profits, two factors that will disappear in 2016. The first is historically low interest rates for a very long time. This has had two effects. One is that it's boosted share prices, as investors are not able to make any return on bonds, other kind of investments. They've been plowing their money into shares, which has sent share prices up over the period in question. And it's also meant incredibly cheap borrowing. Since interest rates at central banks are low, interest rates on the market are low, and companies have been able to load up on loans and do lots of investing, with the result that they've made very, very fat and healthy profits over the last 4 or 5 years. Both of those factors will disappear, as will slowing growth in China really affect the plans of a lot of companies. Companies know this. They're already starting to tighten their belts, recognizing that the last 5 years of relatively easy, fat profit margins are probably by. This is, of course, the legendary unicorn. The last several years have seen a huge rise in the number of so-called unicorns. If you know the term, it's a company, a privately held company with a valuation of over $1 billion. We expect that despite the huge rise in the unicorn in the last few years, that this is going to be a tough one for the unicorns. To put that in numbers, in 2010, there were only 8 so-called unicorns, these billion-dollar companies, and now there are about 141. So the number has multiplied very quickly. Why? Well, as mentioned, investment returns have been hard to come by in other markets, so a lot of investors have plowed money into startups and young companies, hoping to make better returns than they can get, for example, in a bond market. And this has kept unicorns from going public. 15 years ago, in the first big dot-com boom, the first thing you wanted to do was take your company public. Instead, many of the unicorns are doing this and staying private, but this year we expect they will face a cull as the investors that have been putting so much into them start asking for them to finally start making a profit. Last few slides, I'll go through a little bit more quickly. We have Germany expecting a tough year. It has not used its good years, the last few years that it has had, to shore up its public finances and to make reforms to make the country more dynamic. Instead, it has actually handed a lot of the last profits of the last few years into big, expensive social programs like pensions and so forth. And an aging country will really have a hard time with that. FinTech will continue to grow at an extraordinary rate, but you have to remember that even a $10 billion company, we predict that somebody will have to come up with a new name for the $10 billion rather than the $1 billion company, is still a tiny, tiny fraction of, say, the balance sheet of a JP Morgan. So we expect that while FinTech will grow, more important may be the growth of FinTech-like technologies among the big existing players. This will be the year of the organoid. The organoid is not an organ grown in a jar like we see in our cartoon here exactly, but it's a tiny replica of an organ grown from real tissue that can be used to test a large variety of different potential treatments. If you have bowel cancer, the doctor does not know what exactly will work for your bowel and your tumor. He can take out a bit of your small intestines, grow what's called an intestinoid, and test a huge range of treatments on it before trying them on you. He can even grow what's called a tumoroid and try a bunch of different chemotherapies and treatments on there. Second to last here, this is the Olympics. We expect the United States will once again, as it has since '92, lead the medal table. We see New Zealand over there as they're adding rugby sevens to the Olympics. We expect New Zealand to have a good Olympics. And in the middle, sorry, not on the chart, we expect to host Brazil, despite much of the bad news about dirty water and crime and other things, to hold a successful Olympics, as every country that's had a big marquee sporting event, be that the World Cup in South Africa or the Olympics in Athens, to ultimately pull it off successfully. And finally, as a language columnist at The Economist, I wrote a short piece about words of 2016. One is that company names that succeed inevitably become verbs. One of the FinTech stars is Venmo. Expect Venmo maybe to be a verb, increasingly. Venmo being that 10 pounds that you owe me. I see this guy's got, he's riding a bike with a dumb phone. We expect that potentially people will start buying high-design phones that have no smartphone features and ironically christening them dumb phones because hipsters do things like that. He's wearing a Slack t-shirt. Slack is another one of those darling startups, and Slack is already becoming a verb that you'll hear more of in 2016. LDL means let's discuss live. Let's not discuss this in email. This is already a phrase in 2015. Expect the people who look after fraud and attempt to detect people who are trying to get away from scrutiny to look exactly for phrases like LDL in order to detect fraud. So the last thing you want to do, if you're about to commit a fraud in 2016, don't say LDL. And that's all I have time for. Thank you very much.